Chapter 19. It was the day of Commissioner Loeb's funeral. Not everyone had liked the commissioner, and he had certainly had his share of political enemies, but he was a Gothamite. His death had been unjust and untimely, and respect was his due. Just after sunrise, people began gathering along the curbs or staking out space in windows above the streets, some with folding chairs, some with picnic coolers full of snacks, many wearing black armbands. It seemed like everyone had their hands folded, their eyes staring at the ground. Except, maybe, the police. The event had been happening for about an hour. The marchers had traveled less than a mile. For some, this was their moment, their chance to show the world that they were good citizens, decent folk who honored the dead. The police presence was very visible. There was the GCPD marching band, of course, and hundreds of uniforms on the sidewalks and standing in the gutters and directing traffic at intersections. There were an equal number of non-uniformed officers pretending to watch the funeral and really watching everything else. And high above, on the rooftops, tight-lipped men in fatigues peered through the scopes of sniper rifles. Gordon, standing on a corner, keyed his radio and growled, "How's it look on top?" One of the snipers, a 20-year veteran, Sergeant Raphael Mayer, keyed his own radio and replied, "We're tight, but frankly, there's a lot of windows." Gordon looked up at the sun glaring off thousands of glass panes. "Yeah, a lot of windows, all right." Negotiating the streets of Gotham would have been impossible in a car, jammed as they were with mourners. But driving his motorcycle, Bruce could weave and turn and, quite frankly, get to where he was going. And if anyone recognized him, if he had been Batman, everyone would have noticed, followed him, tried to stop him. But Bruce Wayne? Hey, it's just billionaire Bruce up to one of his usual tricks. He braked in an alleyway between two medium-sized apartment buildings, a dozen yards from a parade barrier. He dismounted, grabbed the lowest rung of a fire escape ladder, pulled himself upwards. He continued on to the fifth landing. It took him only moments to open a window and began stalking down a dimly lit corridor. He counted windows and doors until he reached one marked 1502. He pressed his ear against the wood paneling and heard a voice, muffled and booming at once. The mayor's voice. His honor must be making his standard fallen comrades speech in the street directly outside the building. "And as we recognize the sacrifice of this brave sergeant, we must remember that vigilance is the price of..." The same old speech. The collection of cliches the guy mouthed every time a cop or a fireman or a politician died. But if Bruce were right about what was inside apartment 1502, he would be the mayor's last speech, unless he acted. He emptied his mind of expectation and speculation because as Roz had taught him. He had to put himself fully in the present moment when going into combat. He kicked in the door and dived and rolled in, a sniper scope on a tripod at the window. On the floor, 8 men, arms and legs and mouths wrapped in tape. Bruce went up to the nearest one and pulled the tape from his lips. Gasping, the man said, "They took our guns, our uniforms." Guns and uniforms? Bruce sprang to the window and looked through the scope to see the mayor, his honor guard, 8 uniformed men who were raising their rifles, aiming at the mayor. Through the round lens, Bruce could see a face he thought he recognized, the hollowed eyes and gruesome scars. Gordon saw the scarred face too, and for a few seconds tried to place the man's face. Then he realized that the man's rifle was out of sync. Seconds later, he jumped as the rifles fired. Slugs slammed into his back as Gordon lurched into the mayor, and the 2 men tumbled to the pavement. On the rooftop across the street, Sergeant Raphael Mayer heard shots and saw through his scope sunlight glancing off a similar scope in a 5th-floor window. He squeezed the trigger of his weapon. The street was pandemonium. Shouts, screams. The merrymakers, now a mindless mob, desperately afraid, running mindlessly, seeking any kind of safety. 2 of the patrolmen had the presence of mind to shoot at the murderous honor guard. One of the shots found a target, the leg of an honor guardsman, who groaned, dropped his rifle, and folded to the ground. Sergeant Mayer's slugs shattered the upper pane of the window and, as Bruce rolled away, splintered the window frame. He scanned the room to be certain that the bound men, the real honor guard, were out of the line of fire, then sprinted into the corridor. Harvey Dent had been with Rachel Dawes at the podium, standing behind Mayor Garcia along with a dozen other dignitaries when the gunfire began. He pushed Rachel down and told her to stay put, then jumped from the platform and ran forward. The crowd, still mostly confused and in panic, made progress difficult. He was elbowed and jostled, and twice he fell. It took him several minutes to reach the area where the violence had occurred. He saw an ambulance parked in an alleyway between two buildings. He trotted to the ambulance and slipped through the open doors. Inside, the phony guardsman who had been shot was sitting on the edge of a gurney. A paramedic winding a bandage around his leg and two uniformed cops stood nearby, their heads bowed under the low roof. Dent crouched by the guardsman. "Tell me what you know about the Joker." The man smirked. Then Dent noticed the name tag on his uniform. Officer Rachel Dawes. Dent glanced past the guardsman and saw through a small window past the driver's seat was empty, and the keys were in the ignition. He told the cops to be sure the area was secure, and after they'd gone, he circled to the front of the ambulance, got in, and drove away. Clara Street, near the city limits, was a crowded block in a poor state, with run-down buildings, broken sidewalks, and very little green where the neighborhood's children could play. The Gordon house was a modest building in the middle of the block. Barbara Gordon stood speechless on the run-down front porch as Officer Gerard Stevens tried to console her. "I'm sorry, Barbara," Stevens said, placing a hand on her shoulder. Barbara brushed it off and stepped past Stevens. She looked out in the dark and shouted, "Are you there? Are you? You brought this on us! You did! You brought this!" Her voice caught. She sobbed and collapsed into Stevens' arms. Batman was nearby. He hung his head. It was dark in Gotham City by 8, and the streets were emptier than usual. All civic events and most theater and musical performances had been canceled following the afternoon shooting. The movie houses and multiplexes and nightclubs were still open, and a few citizens were inside them, determined to be amused no matter how far into despair everyone else had fallen. At police headquarters, all of the Gotham City major crimes units stood next to the searchlight, its beam vanishing into a cloudless sky. "Let's switch it off," Officer Stevens said. "He ain't coming. He doesn't want to talk to us. God help whomever he does want to talk to."